October 13th, 2010 is a day that many of us will never forget. Just 69 days earlier, a significant cave-in at the Golden Copper Mine in San Jose, Chile had left 33 Chilean miners trapped 2,300 feet below the surface. Immediately, search and rescue workers were brought in to see if anyone could have survived the cave-in. And in that moment, it looked like this would be the most tragic moment in the mine's troubled history. We would find in the days and weeks to come that this mine had had a past, that literally in the last 21 years or so, 8 people had already died. But in this moment, it looked like it would be the most tragic moment in the mine's troubled history. The search and rescue workers began to drill 8 boreholes into the ground to see if they could make contact with anyone who might have made their way to the rescue shelter. And 17 days into search and rescue, on one of the drill bits that was drilled into those boreholes, in bright red letters, a note read, "We are well in the shelter, signed the 33." You can imagine the joy and exuberance that began to explode around the mine as people began to realize that the 33 had actually made their way to a shelter. But the question that almost immediately came to mind, even as people were celebrating, is how are we going to go back in and get these guys? Literally, the word began to spread around the mine all around Chile, and people began all around Chile to leverage any resource that could be used to try and rescue these guys that were trapped 2,300 feet below the surface. Other countries began to get involved. People all over the world began to leverage their resources and assets. At the U.S., we began to leverage NASA and its capability to try and figure out how to go down and get these guys. And 69 days into search and rescue, the first miner was brought back above the surface. It was one of those moments, and it was almost like the whole world stopped to just watch this moment happen. Every news channel was focused on it. No matter where you were almost stopping in your tracks to see what would happen. And I remember as I was watching the news coverage of this, when the first miner was brought back up in that pod, he got out, he kissed his kids and his wife, he thanked God. It was one of those moments that if you were watching, just felt good to be alive, felt good to be human, to think that we could go down and rescue these guys and bring them back above the surface. And one by one, in about 90 to 120 minute intervals, every one of the miners was brought back above the surface. When the 33rd guy was brought back above the surface, the paramedics who had gone down in the mine to check on the guys while they were down there held up a sign that said, "Mission accomplished." Again, it was just one of those moments where it felt good to be a human being. The guys began to tell their stories on the late night talk shows and the nightly news. They talked about how they had survived 69 days, 2,300 feet below the surface, how they had survived 48 days at a time on just a spoonful of tuna. And for a while, their story was on the front pages of every news blog, front pages of every headline news and newspaper of the day. But eventually, their story began to fall out of the headlines and really out of the news altogether. 1 year later, CNN went back to check on the miners to see how they were doing. And several of them were doing well, but others of them were struggling. There was one guy who had been arrested for domestic abuse. As you can imagine, several were dealing with panic and anxiety disorders. There was one guy who was building a wall around his house, and he had no idea why he was doing it. And the question that CNN raised a year later was this: do the miners need a second rescue? Because even though they had been rescued from death, what they were struggling with was adjusting back into life. They knew how to be rescued from death, but they'd kind of forgotten how to live. I want to start with that picture because I think it paints a picture of where many of us find ourselves as Christians today. We know how to be rescued from death, but we struggle adjusting back into life. In other words, we know how to let God save us. But do we know how to really design our life and live? The reason I know this is a primary problem for us today is because I know lots of Christians who know how to be forgiven, but I know very few Christians who know how to live free. In other words, so many times as Christians, our lives just deteriorate to just looking like everyone else's life. It's just that we have a big "I'm sorry" at the end of our life. But what if we began to not just live forgiven, but free? What if we picked up the other part of the gospel? Yes, the gospel is about living forgiven of our sin, but the other half of the gospel is about living in the freedom that we were always designed to live with. Now, I know as quick as I talk about freedom, I got to redefine that, because we live in a world today that believes freedom is the ability to do anything you want to do. Can I just tell you, freedom is not the ability to do anything you want to do. Freedom is the capability of becoming who you were always destined to be. Freedom is not the ability to do anything you want to do. If that's freedom, I know a lot of people who are doing anything they want to do that find themselves in incredible captivity. Freedom is the capability of becoming who you were always destined to be. Now, here's what I want to suggest to you as we start this journey together. God's been dreaming about your life from the beginning of time. And part of what the gospel does is it recovers the God dream that God's been having in His imagination long before you came into being. This is what Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 2. Remember, the question behind every epistle is, what does it mean to be Christian? Behind every letter in the New Testament, whether it's Paul or John or anyone else, they're trying to articulate for the first time what it means to be Christian. Remember, no one's ever asked that question before. People are having Jesus experiences, and now they're asking, what's that mean for life? And there are really two options on the table. One option is that people say, you just need to be Jewish. You need to go into becoming a Jew. And others are just saying, just live Gentile, live however you want. And Paul and John and the other apostles begin to write to say, no, this is what it means to be Christian. And it's why in so many of Paul's epistles, he starts his declaration with the gospel, because he doesn't want what he says to the churches to be behavior modification. He wants it to be character formation based off a gospel-centered life. And so in Ephesians chapter 2, he's writing to the church at Ephesus, but it's a general letter for everyone. He begins to re-articulate the gospel. Verse 1, he says, "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is not work in those who are disobedient. All of us have lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our sinful nature and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature objects of wrath." In other words, he's just describing the cave-in that has been all of our lives. Because of choices that we made, brokenness that's chosen us, there's been a cave-in. And here's the rescue effort. Verse 4, "But because of His great love for us, God, who's rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in our transgressions and sins. It's by grace you have been saved." That's the first half of the gospel. We've been forgiven of our transgressions. We've been made alive in Christ. But if you go down to verse 10, here's the second part of the gospel. And this is what the unique journey is all about. Verse 10, it says this, "For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." He says, not only have you been forgiven, but part of what the gospel does is it reclaims that which you were created for. He says that you're God's workmanship, God's poem. The word there in Greek is poema. It's where we get the word poem from, God's highest work of art. And he clarifies that by saying, created to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. In other words, God's been having a dream about your life from the beginning of time. That long before you came into existence, you were in God's imagination. So here's the unique proposition. What if that dream, that God dream, is both knowable and nameable? Well, we believe that it is. And part of what the gospel helps us do is reclaim that God dream in our life. So the next question that we have to face is this: how do I begin to discover it? And this is what our first master tool, called the Clarity Spiral, is built to address. The clarity spiral helps answer the question, what does the journey to stunning clarity look like? Now, to be honest with you, most of us, when we think about stunning clarity, would love the journey to look like a straight line from A to B. But the truth is, the journey to stunning clarity in our life actually looks more like a spiral. It's a climbing up a mountain or a drilling down of sorts. This is the journey that the gospel invites us on to become who God's always made us to be. And that journey is filled with a couple of imperatives that following Christ often is associated with. First, we got to have courage to know. Second, we've got to have experience to grow. Third, we have to have value to show. And finally, we have to have risk to go. In the videos that are coming, we're going to walk through each of these imperatives. We're going to dissect them one by one and talk about what this journey looks like. But as we make this journey is going to start with what we call inventory. We're going to inventory our lives to take a look at what has already been given to us. We're going to interpret that inventory next. After we interpret it, we're going to inscribe it or name it. And finally, as we get to the center of the clarity spiral, we're going to implement it. Clarity spiral answers the question, what does the journey to stunning clarity, becoming who God's always made me to be, look like? It's also, by the way, the reason why in this journey you're going to face the same kinds of things over and over again. It's not because you're backsliding. It's just that as you climb the mountain, you get greater and greater perspective over time. So you dealt with your identity at 500 feet. You're going to deal with it at 1,000 feet. You're going to deal with it at 1,500 feet. You're not backsliding. You're dealing with the same stuff, but you're getting greater and greater perspective. Well, in our next video, we're going to deal with the courage to know. We're going to talk about why it's necessary for us to come to awareness, not just of God, but of ourselves. And the question that I want you to be thinking about between now and then is this: do you have courage to know yourself and know God? Because you can't be who God has dreamed you to be if you're afraid to know yourself or you're afraid to know God. So in our next video, we're going to come back and unpack the imperative, the courage to know. I look forward to seeing you there. Do you have courage to know yourself? Do you have courage to know God? That's what the courage to know imperative is all about.